Pamela Andrews, superhero? Samuel Richardson wrote his famous epistolary novel Pamela in 1740. His novel tells the story of the young title character Pamela, whose mistress's son becomes infatuated and obsessed with her after his mother dies. For the majority of the novel, the mistress's son, Mr. B, makes advances on Pamela that border on rape, and Pamela very pointedly turns him down to preserve her virtue. This goes on for the majority of the novel until a certain point where Mr. B gradually realizes how crude and arguably cruel he has been to Pamela, and begins to make genuine and sincere advances on her, to which Pamela responds well. Eventually, the two end up betrothed, as opposed to him essentially raping her at the beginning of the novel and robbing her of her virtue. Many modern critics and public audiences argue that Pamela defending her virtue so strongly is simply unrealistic and is in fact an act that she is putting on. Henry Fielding's satirical response to Pamela, Shamala, is a paragon embodiment of this belief. I, however, do not see Pamela as a sham, but rather as an ideal heroine who readers from this time period can look up to. In our modern society, we have stories like this all the time. They are always topping the charts at the box office, and they are a personal favorite of mine. Superhero movies. The idea of a superhero dates back to 1917 at the latest, and the concept has taken off ever since. The general idea of a superhero story is that there is a single hero or heroine who is gifted with with supernatural powers not only physically, but also morally. He or she is generally an incorruptible, self-righteous person who is a living embodiment of society's ideal morals, as in they are what society wishes they could be. In my absolute favorite superhero movie of all time, The Dark Knight, about my absolute favorite superhero of all time, Batman, also known as the Dark Knight, Batman defeats his nemesis, the Joker, not by killing him, but by foiling his plans, subduing him, and refusing to kill him or anyone at all, and at one point even saving his life. To this, the Joker says, "You truly are incorruptible, aren't you?" Nobody in our society truly wants to kill anybody, yet unfortunately we see it happen on the news far more often than we as a community would be willing to admit. The Batman story shows us that we can still do good solely for the sake of doing good and without wrongfully taking a life. He is an ideal. Ideal is the same word that many critics have used to describe Richardson's Pamela, or rather, too ideal. If people nowadays don't question Batman or Superman as being too ideal, why do we question Pamela? When describing social ideals during Richardson's time, Corin Harrell says, "Virtue depends upon preservation of her virginity, while she remains unmarried." In Richardson's time, what society saw as an ideal was abstinence from coitus out of wedlock. While not many women in that time went to such extremes as fainting to prevent this like Pamela, not many women were approached so often and with such persistence and vigor as Pamela was by Mr. B. Thus, we have the supervillain, Mr. B, and the superhero, or rather superheroine, Pamela, who is so incorruptible that she will not succumb to Mr. B's countless advances, even considering that he is in fact her superior. Cultures and customs change with each generation, and our current generation doesn't hold virtue quite as high as Richardson's generation did. Just look at any TV show on MTV, like 16 and Pregnant. And so we find Pamela's virtuous story perhaps a little too cheesy or cliche, but who knows? God forbid, but maybe someday, killing won't be quite as taboo as it is now, and almost all of our successful superhero movies will be too ideal. So, I believe that Pamela unwaveringly rejecting all of Mr. B's rash advances is more or less the 1740 equivalent of a modern superhero story. Why else would people gather in the town square to hear the story told? To hear the story of an ideal that they can strive to live up to. Robert Donovan reflects on the satirists and critics of Pamela and says that Fielding and his successors in the anti-Pamelist tradition are beating a dead horse, if indeed that horse ever lived. I agree with Donovan in that the satirists and critics of Pamela are simply overthinking this story. Yes, Pamela may be a little over the top, but it is created this way for a reason. Imagine how different all of our childhoods would be if we grew up with Batman cartoons where he snapped the Joker's neck, or where Superman beat Lex Luthor to death. All our morals, everything that we believe to be ideal, would be altered and/or lost. The same goes for Pamela. Yes, the novel can appear to be unrealistic, but that is by design. The fact that Pamela's actions are so outlandish captivates the attention of her audience, as evidenced by the town square readings of the novel, and gives all of us imperfect human beings something to strive towards, particularly back in the 1740s when virtue and virginity were held with even higher regard than they are now. Pamela Andrews may not be a very conventional superhero, especially by our modern terms, but by the moral expectations and ideals of 1740, Pamela Andrews could very well have been a 1740 equivalent of Wonder Woman, incorrupt and super. And so, I contest that Pamela Andrews is not a sham, nor is she realistic, nor should she be, because she is merely an incorruptible, fictitious ideal. Thank you.